Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you, I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Shall we get into it here? What do you think of the new music? Honestly, I changed it up and now I don't remember how long the song is. I think it's close to 3 minutes, but I forgot how long it is. All right, we are on chapter 14 of 15. So, and I already looked ahead. This one's only 23 pages, so it should be a fairly short read tonight. The fifth one, or the 15th one, the last one, is going to be fairly long because it is the chapter plus the epilogue. I don't see any reason to drag it out. We'll go a little long that night. Oh, maybe not. Holy crap. The last chapter is 40 some odd pages by itself, or damn near 40 pages. So I may have to, I don't know if I can make it through 40 pages plus the epilogue. The epilogue is another 10. So I don't know, man. I don't know if I might have to think about that one. I don't think my voice will hold out for 50 pages. So you may have to just be creative about that and find a good stopping point in the chapter and then finish it and the epilogue in another one. But we're not there yet. We're going to do chapter 14, The Enlightenment as a Source of Anti-Slavery Thought, Utility and Natural Law. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, it is The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. David Bryan Davis won the Pulitzer Prize in 1967. Okay, so here we go. Such a narrowing of alternatives suggests increasing moral uncertainty in the mind of the Enlightenment. When poets like Diogenes de Ponso, I guess that's probably not Diogeny, but anyway, celebrated the impending insurrection of the slaves, they were really endorsing a Hobbesian view that power justifies itself. De Holbach bluntly conceded there must be a perpetual conflict between man's will to freedom and his will to dominate. Diderot concluded that it was only the individual's natural impulse to free himself from external authority that prevented all humanity from becoming slaves in a meaningless stream of generations. But what was the relation between individual liberty and the stream of generations? Was history no more than a cyclical fluctuation between de Holbach's principles of freedom and domination? There had been other periods of relative liberty and enlightenment, but they had not endured. Were decadence and enslavement the ultimate price for human progress? This possibility haunted even the optimists who congratulated themselves on living in the 18th century. Their uncertainty helps to account for oh, whoops, I just noticed I don't have captions. Sorry. There we go. Now they're going. I apologize for not having them up sooner. This possibility haunted even the optimists who congratulated themselves on living in the 18th century. Their uncertainty helps to account for a growing ambivalence toward the New World. There could be no doubt that the expansion and economic progress of Europe had been closely connected with the discovery of America. The very existence of a new world had helped to disintegrate old assumptions in a solvent of unlimited possibilities. The great question, however, was whether this dissolution of traditional limitations had increased the cumulative happiness of the human race. For all their faith in the individual freedom, the philosophers were often obsessed by the ancient fear of moral decay as the inevitable result of luxury and a pursuit of wealth. The most striking modern example, as British Protestants had long insisted, was the denigration of the Iberians following their orgy of greed and cruelty in the New World. The quote-unquote black legend of the Spanish conquest could be used by either Protestants or philosophers to illustrate the depravity of the old Catholic order. But then the entire history of American colonization seemed to show what extremes of waste, suffering, and tyranny one could expect when man's self-interest went unrestrained. Through the writings of Montesquieu, Diderot, Raynal, and Condorcet maybe, the sense of shock deepened. After enslaving and exterminating the innocent Indians, the Europeans had turned to depopulate Africa. The New World, quote, the New World, wrote de Sacy, does not have enough slaves. Our needs, our desires are greater than the continent itself, end quote. This meant that Jean-François de Saint-Lambert, that the discovery of America had been a lethal event for 3/4 of the world's inhabitants. And what asked numerous philosophers, were the end products that justified such misery? The ladies of Europe had brighter dyes for their dresses. They had more rouge for their cheeks. They had chocolate to eat and sugar to sweeten their tea. When earlier writers like Morgan Godwin and Thomas Tryon had commented on the same irony, they could assume that avarice and luxury were marks of man's sinful nature, and that a righteous society required a tight reining of individual self-interest. But without the Christian framework of sin and redemption, how was one to interpret the relation between oppression and self-indulgence? According to Bernard Mandeville, whose views were influential in France as well as England, the wasteful follies and luxuries of the rich were an indispensable stimulus to industry. Rational analysis when freed from superstitious asceticism, showed that civilization rested on the individual's pursuit of pleasure. But according to Rousseau, who was also convinced that superstitions distorted men's view of reality, civilization was itself a sham. Only a total reconstruction of society could end the vicious system which enslaved the mass of humanity to the selfish interests of a privileged few. These were, in a sense, the polar extremes of the divided mind of the Enlightenment. In one view, norms were to be derived from an empirical description of human experience. Society was regulated by immanent laws which were as unalterable as the laws of the physical universe. In the other view, there was an absolute gulf between society as it existed and the transcendent laws of nature. Neither position provided the basis for perceiving a single institution as an unmitigated evil. Even by the mid-18th century, however, philosophers had discovered a middle way which appeared to synthesize empirical reality with the rational ideal. Turgot agreed with Mandeville that man's selfish passions, his greed, and his injustices all served useful functions, but the ultimate end to which all human experience contributed was a utopia of reason and love. From the beginning of history, man had staggered blindly forward, unaware that his movements were always in the right direction, that his sins were redeemed by time. Such an idea of inevitable progress was an antidote for both complacency and discontent. It provided, by the last third of the 18th century, a meeting ground for devout Christians and secular philosophers who were equally in need of believing that the sufferings of the past had prepared the way for an age of reason and benevolence. A faith in inevitable progress could, of course, be as stifling to reform as was the theodicy, which showed that this was the best of all possible worlds. In making notations in his copy of Lord Kame's Principles of Morality and Natural Religion, Thomas Jefferson drew from history an example of the progressive development of man's moral sense. The enslavement of prisoners of war had surely been a marked improvement over their brutal slaughter. Enlightenment had now progressed so far that Montesquieu had shown that even enslavement was no longer a humane necessity. Some day, no doubt, nations would look with horror on the ransoming of captives. Jefferson clearly felt that each custom had served a progressive function in its particular stage of moral evolution, and while he earnestly desired to see an end to Negro slavery, his faith in progress smothered the sense of urgency he felt when he was calling for the abolition of entail or the separation of church and state. I'm not sure what that abolition of entail is. It all depended on whether the past was seen as the seedbed of the future or as a rotting husk that threatened to impede healthy growth. The belief that history moved through a logical succession of ascending stages did not preclude the possibility of conflict between the forces of progress and retrogression. If the promotion of human happiness was ultimately to become a science, it was the business of the legislator to ask whether existing institutions were the most effective means of harmonizing private interests with the public good. And for men who strove for scientific objectivity, such a question could best be met by quantitative standards. In the eyes of early utilitarians, for example, it was unlikely that an institution could be contrary to the public interest if it encouraged a steady growth in population. David Hume was anything but an abolitionist, but in 1752 he helped to put the slavery controversy in a new perspective by demolishing the traditional belief that, owing to the great fertility of slaves, Europe's population had been vastly larger in antiquity than in modern times. For our purposes, the most significant points Hume made were these. He maintained that the rate of population growth is dependent upon economic and social institutions. He argued that neither slave nor livestock could profitably be bred where costs were high, as in large cities, which explained why Romans had relied on an influx of bondsmen from the provinces. He observed that where the ratio of slaves to free men, or where the ratio of slaves to free men was disproportionately large, as in the American colonies, the result must be an insecurity and a severity of discipline which would retard the growth of population. The implication was that the institution was a kind of economic aberration which consumed itself the more it grew. A year before Hume's essay appeared, Benjamin Franklin had recorded similar thoughts on slavery in his Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind. Franklin had owned Negro servants as late as 1750, and it would appear that his desire to get rid of them was more a product of racial prejudice than humanitarianism. But while his moral concern over slavery arose only late in life, Franklin was perhaps the first modern man to subject the institution to a bookkeeping analysis. In an age when people were easily impressed by any statistical evidence, he calculated the cost of American slave labor in terms of original investment, risk, lack of interest on capital, and maintenance, and discovered that it was far more expensive than free labor in England. This, he claimed, put the colonies at a disadvantage in trade, and not only was the mortality of slaves greater than their natural increase, but the institution impeded the growth of white population by depriving the poor of employment and enfeebling the rich with luxury. Then why did Americans continue to buy Negroes? There was, Franklin conceded, a shortage of white labor, and hired workers soon left their jobs to acquire land of their own. In 1756, the year after Franklin's figures were published, the Marquis de Mirabeau presented the world with a systematic treatise on population growth, economic laws, and human happiness. If a nation was a tree, he said, the leaves would be commerce, the branches would be industry, the roots would be agriculture, and the trunk population. As a skilled horticulturist, the wise sovereign should encourage healthy growth by removing all impediments to the free operation of natural laws. He should realize that commerce and industry, while vulnerable to passing storms, would prosper if population continued to grow, and that this, in turn, would be assured by a healthy state of agriculture. He should pursue the utilitarian ideal of increasing the total happiness of the human race by looking into nature for the secrets of fecundity and abundance. For Mirabeau, as for Quesnay and the later physiocrats, progress could not be economically and morally secure unless harmonized with a primitivistic ideal of the land as the source of all goodness. Given these assumptions, Mirabeau could only conclude that the American colonies were blighted by a disease that threatened the progress of Europe. Instead of nourishing liberty, prosperity, and happiness, colonial agriculture destroyed population and depleted the soil. Mirabeau was as indignant as a Christian moralist over the arguments of men like Hume and Mellon, who justified luxury on grounds of social utility. True progress required freedom of trade and a wider distribution of goods. Yet colonization had led to a form of commercial exploitation that allowed the avarice and overconsumption of a small group to choke the sources of healthy growth. The principle of slavery had infected colonial commerce as well as colonial labor. It might seem that Mirabeau would have had reform begin at the roots with a transformation of American agriculture, but he was a fervent believer in the rights of private property and the beneficent effects of individual self-interest, when unrestrained by artificial barriers. He showed little interest in the plight of the Negro and feared the dangers of miscegenation. I don't know what that is. If anybody knows, let me know. His remedy, therefore, was to open America to the free trade of the world. As soon as economic laws were allowed to operate without obstruction, the colonists would see the unprofitableness of Negro slavery. Free labor would be attracted to those employments most useful to humanity, and there would emerge a great commercial commonwealth which would distribute the benefits of technology and civilization to all mankind. It must be emphasized that Negro slavery was a matter of small concern to such writers as Franklin, Hume, and Mirabeau, and that their brief comments on the subject can hardly be taken as evidence of an upswell of anti-slavery sentiment. But the deepening imperial conflicts of the mid-18th century gave a new importance to even such casual attempts to judge colonial slavery by the laws of economic and historical development. In the 7 Years' War, prized sugar islands were devastated and captured. Fear of slave insurrection rose to a heightened pitch. European governments sagged from the pressure of mounting debts, and France lost the greater part of her colonial empire. So sudden a transformation in the balance of power brought a growing awareness of the instability and inefficiency of the old colonial system. We have noted how Malachi Postlethwaite praised the slave trade as, quote, an inexhaustible fund of wealth and naval power, end quote, and then concluded in 1757 that since France was winning economic dominance in the Caribbean, Britain's interest lay in developing Africa. In 1756, the Abbé Coyer, or Coyer, I guess, I don't know, thought it was essential for France to expand the slave trade. A decade later, he favored its abandonment. In 1765, one of Mirabeau's disciples, the Abbé Baudot, founded a journal which championed agrarianism and free trade, rustic simplicity and economic progress, natural rights and social utility. As a vehicle for physiocratic ideas, Ephémérides de Citoyen was highly critical of the wastefulness of the old colonial system and looked upon the recent loss of Canada as a blessing in disguise. For Baudot, the key to America's future and to the future of Western civilization lay in the immense regions of Virgin Island that stretched westward from the Virgin Land, that stretched westward from the Mississippi. Reviving the old dream of La Salle, he described the great agrarian empire that would arise one day in Louisiana. And since Spain had no means of settling so vast an area, he proposed that colonization be undertaken as a joint enterprise by France, Spain, and Sicily, with each nation pooling her resources in an international company. Settlers could be recruited from Germany and Central Europe, but Baudot assumed that this project would also require large numbers of Negroes from the coast of Africa. And 37 years before the Louisiana Purchase, 54 years before the Missouri Compromise, the editor of the magazine, in French, the FM, raised the momentous question whether slavery should be permitted on the prairies of North America. Baudot showed great concern for the sensitivity of French planters in the Caribbean, who, he said, had been reconciled to slavery by long custom and perhaps by necessity. Since Europeans only bought men who had already been enslaved, and since the practice had been sanctioned by the government, one must refrain from moral judgment. And yet Baudot considered slavery a barbarous evil. In words that echoed Rousseau, he condemned the pride and cupidity of the first man who pretended that another was his slave. Nothing could be more inhumane and self-defeating than to fasten slavery on a new colony whose very basis was human liberty and progress. European settlers would live in freedom and simplicity, relieved of all dues and obligations except for a general tax consisting of 1/11 of their produce. If Negro slaves were purchased in Africa, transported to Louisiana, and transformed into free citizens, the company could still make a profit by charging a perpetual rent of 1/6 or 1/5 of all their produce. The Africans would not mind such discrimination, since their condition would have been improved, and in any event they had been something about slavery. It's in French. Even this cautious free soil proposal drew an angry retort from the French correspondent, who said he had been born in a colony whose very existence depended on slavery. The writer demanded that Badeau retract his aspersions on the morality of colonists, admit the inferiority of Negroes, and recognize slavery as a positive good. This provided the editor with an opportunity to develop a philosophic basis for opposing slavery. For Badeau, the first principle of knowledge and judgment was the universal accord between natural law and the true self-interest of all men. But by nature, man was endowed with the animal instinct to search for food and to seize and consume what he could find. This instinct was the source of man's first labor and of his first ideas of goodness and natural right. Unlike other animals, his reason enabled him to mitigate the pains and anxieties of the struggle for survival by respecting the right of his fellow creatures to consume the products of their labor. This sense of trust and mutual interest was anterior to all social conventions and was founded on each man's proprietorship of his own person. The social compact, while entailing certain duties for the common interest, did not alter primitive liberties, and between men of different societies the law of nature was the only governing force. To deprive a man of his elemental freedom to work and enjoy the fruits of his effort was therefore the primal sin against both nature and the interests of mankind. It was inevitable that wherever slavery existed, something about disorder, injustice, bad. I don't know. All in French. Badeau admitted that his argument would have no force if it could be shown that Negroes were not true men. But despite the corrupting effects of slavery, the laws and behavior of white colonists gave eloquent proof that the Negro, no matter how degraded, was a man. In 1768, Dupont de Nemours had succeeded Badeau as editor of that magazine, the Ephemerides, blah, blah, blah. And in the next few years, the journal became the leading organ for economic arguments against slavery. In 1771, Dupont drew upon Franklin's now famous essay, when he had visited Paris in 1767, that Philadelphian had been lionized by the physiocrats and had even contributed to Ephemerides, the magazine, and printed detailed calculations to show the unprofitableness of slave labor. When the Academy of Bordeaux offered a prize for the best plan for making the slave trade more humane, Dupont exposed the fatal flaw in all such thinking. To improve the condition or reduce the number of Negroes on each ship would make an already precarious trade intolerably costly and dangerous. Long before Burke proposed his own scheme, Dupont insisted that in such a trade profit and humanity were incompatible. The only solution was to abolish the trade and, by diversifying crops and providing new incentives, transform the colonial labor system. Dupont showed particular enthusiasm for an idea which had been suggested in 1762 by the Abbé Roubaud, which had been promoted in England by the Quaker physician John Fothergill, and which ultimately inspired Henry Thornton, Granville Sharp, and other philanthropists to found Sierra Leone. As an alternative to the expensive system of slave trade and American colonies, why not use free labor for the cultivation of tropical staples on the coast of Africa? DuPont was encouraged by a travel account of Pierre Poivre, published in 1768, which reported that sugar cane was grown by free laborers in Cochin, China. Poivre, who was president of the Royal Society of Agriculture at Lyon, also blamed slavery for the low level of African civilization. A comparison of the world's nations proved that civilization depended upon a healthy state of agriculture, and that agriculture could flourish only where there was freedom and justice. It followed then that science offered Europe a second chance at colonization. With a single stroke, she might redeem the mistakes she had made in America, assure herself a cheap supply of tropical produce, and bring freedom and civilization to the dark continent. The dream would fire the imagination of William Pitt and endure for at least a century. What did I say? 42? Ooh, maybe not. 445 is our last page. Okay. Okay, is this where we were? Yeah. There were those, however, who thought that economists should stick to hard facts. This was the approach of Turgot, whose reflections on the formation, distribution of wealth, I think, became one of the classics of physiocracy. Turgot agreed with his philosophe friends that slavery violated the laws of humanity, but this did not mean that the institution was exempt from the laws of economics. All wealth was derived from the land. When there was much land in relation to labor, proprietors often resorted to coercion. But slave labor was a temporary expedient, since it was uneconomical in the long run. The cost of slaves was certain to rise as the supply diminished. Proprietors would discover there was a greater profit in hiring free labor or in charging rent. DuPont was a close friend of Turgot and felt at liberty to revise the text of Reflections in 1769, when he began reprinting the book in his journal. Turgot had used slaves and cattle as examples of fluid capital. DuPont deleted slaves from this discussion and added arguments to show that slavery was always unprofitable, as well as being a crime against humanity. Turgot, intensely annoyed by those unauthorized changes, defended his position in a series of letters. He acknowledged that Franklin had shown slave labor to be more expensive than one might think, but this did not prove that it was unprofitable for individual proprietors, especially those who wanted to make quick fortunes from commodities of high commercial value. Moreover, slavery might serve the interest of a country that valued wealth and commerce more than an increase in population. Turgot was sympathetic with DuPont's moral objections, but unfortunately, he said, men did not always suffer from their injustices. Utility and righteousness coincided only in the long sweep of history. Pause for a second here. I'm actually going to take those off. Going a little bug-eyed tonight. Need to adjust my distance from the cheaters or something. Yeah. Excuse me. only in the long sweep of history. Okay. Although the physiocrats helped to encourage an anti-slavery opinion, the division between DuPont and Turgot was symptomatic of fundamental problems that would long haunt economic liberalism. Even the facts of history, Given the facts of history, how could it be known that slavery how could it be shown how could it be shown that slavery was not a natural expression of individual self-interest and thus in accordance with economic laws? Was there not a contradiction in arguing that slavery was always unprofitable and then condemning slaveholders for avarice, as if one still believed mammonism to be a sin? How could one say that the worst thing about perpetual bondage was its crushing effect on incentive and ambition, and then denounce the incentive and ambition of slave traders? Finally, the physiocrats would substitute purely economic relations for those based on privilege and prescriptive power, but without intervention by a power independent of economic interests. How was the Negro to be protected and helped? And as West Indian planters would continually ask, what disciplinary force would keep the Negro at work in a tropical climate where food could easily be grown or even picked from trees? In the mid-1760s, Turgot and other physiocrats entertained a brilliant Scottish philosopher whose ideas had much in common with their own. Adam Smith had already developed an ingenious worldview from the ideas of his mentor, Francis Hutcheson. According to Smith, the laws of social relations promoted benevolence and happiness because there was perfect harmony between morality, which arose from our spontaneous inclination to identify ourselves with others, and utility, which was the product of our self-interested decisions as economic men. In 1759, in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith had found that the Golden Rule was grounded in a psychology of sympathetic association. This provided a moral basis for condemning slavery. It was, however, with the wealth of nations, which owed something to his physiocratic friends, that Smith made his significant contribution to the anti-slavery cause. As everyone knows, Smith attacked the entire network of laws, customs, and usages which stifled initiative and kept individual self-interest from advancing the public good. Sorry, what's going on here? Okay. Slavery was simply part of this disharmonious system of monopoly and special privilege. Indeed, the relations between slave and master epitomized those artificial restraints that prevented self-interest from being harnessed to the general good. For if a man had no chance of obtaining property, it was clearly in his interest to work as little as possible. This self-evident deduction was confirmed by experience, which, as DuPont had said, universally showed that slavery was the most costly and least productive form of labor. Like Turgot, Smith was certain that economic causes explained the abolition of bondage in Western Europe. Landowners simply came to realize that their profits would increase by giving labor a share of the produce. But even in the early 1760s, in his lectures at the University of Glasgow, Smith had acknowledged that a small part of Western Europe was the only portion of the globe free from slavery. Why then were so many men blind to their own self-interest? Smith's answer was that they were corrupted by pride. They loved domination and found it distasteful to persuade their inferiors to work. Consequently, they preferred slave labor when it was permitted by law and by the nature of the work. If this distinction between the love of power and economic self-interest appeared to solve the problem, it did not remove a number of paradoxes. Smith took note of the report that American Quakers had resolved to free their slaves. He agreed with the Abbé Raynal, however, that this would have been impossible if slaves had formed a major part of the Quakers' property. Pride might distort the judgment of economic men, but philanthropy was evidently not a sufficient motive for the sacrifice of wealth. A second puzzle was that slave labor, being highly expensive, could not be afforded by the growers of the less lucrative crops, but this meant that the institution was linked with the most profitable kind of agriculture, and Smith also associated wealth with lax and careless management of labor. Where the rich planter was inattentive to high costs of maintenance, the manager of free labor, being frugal, parsimonious, and efficient, kept wages as low as possible. Yet this might well imply that wage earners received less return for their labor than did slaves. Finally, Smith held that involuntary servitude was more humane and profitable under despotic governments, which allowed magistrates to interfere with the management of private property. In a free country where the rights of property were protected and masters had a voice in the government, there was little chance of elevating slaves to a higher level of intelligence and usefulness. One might conclude that nothing could be worse than American Negroes than Smith's entire program of economic reform. But such a conclusion would mean that the institution was unnatural in a double sense. It reversed the law which said individual self-interest must advance the public good, and its improvement required the strong hand of a despotic government. Before abandoning mankind to the invisible hand of nature, perhaps it was necessary that there be one last act of arbitrary power. Excuse me. In 1771, 5 years before the appearance of The Wealth of Nations, one of Smith's students and protégés had published a sociological study which must be rated as one of the most imaginative products of the Scottish Enlightenment. Although he has long been overshadowed by better known men, John Millar, who was professor of civil law at the University of Glasgow, anticipated many themes that would preoccupy social scientists in the eras of Darwin, Marx, and Freud. For Millar, property relationships were the key to the various stages of social evolution, which he defined as hunting, pastoral, agricultural, commercial, and manufacturing. Closely related to forms of property holding were distinctive institutions which regulated authority and sexual relations. Economic activity and authority of fathers, the position of women, social rank, laws, customs, and uses of leisure all formed a pattern of functional relationships. And in judging cultural and historical variations, Millar was a strict relativist. Primitive men appeared to be free and independent only because they lived in wretched want. As soon as the need rose, they quickly submitted to the most absolute authority. Sexual freedom was appropriate to the simplest societies where its consequences could not be injurious. Refined tastes and humanitarian sentiments could serve no useful purpose in the rough life of the barbarian. Yet man's evolution moved irresistibly, though at differing rates of speed, from a state of freedom, coarseness, observance, and poverty, through a stage of authority and restraint, to a high level of wealth, liberty, science, and sexual equality. In Millar's eyes, no revolution in history had advanced human happiness as much as the abolition of slavery in Europe. Nevertheless, his momentous progress had been the result of purely utilitarian causes. After the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, populations had been dispersed over such vast areas of land that slave labor could no longer be supervised. As a consequence of this problem of labor discipline and of political struggles between kings and barons, the servi gradually acquired rights and privileges. Finally, a change in laws and customs, particularly in the nature of warfare and in the punishment of criminals, removed any legal basis for personal slavery. When the institution was revived in the American colonies, Europeans had been forced to pay the expense of purchasing and transporting men from primitive nations. This reversion to an early stage of development had not been simply the result of pride and lust for power, but had been encouraged by that, quote, blind prepossession, which is commonly acquired in favor of ancient usages, end quote. In spite of the fact that slavery was uneconomical and became more oppressive as society progressed, public opinion either remained indifferent or regarded any proposal innovation as dangerous. Sorry, that got a little rough there. Miller encountered certain difficulties in explaining cultural lag. He assumed that slavery in America violated the same laws of utility which had brought its gradual disappearance in Europe, yet he admitted to important qualifications. He admitted two important qualifications. There was no conclusive evidence to show that whites could replace Negro laborers in the hotter climates, and because a concentrated labor force was required for the cultivation of such staples as sugar, there was less need to substitute individual incentive for external discipline. In fact, slavery had persisted even in Scotland among the colliers and salters, some of whom wore collars bearing their owners' names. Men would not suffer much Men would not suffer such degradation, Miller thought, unless they received more sustenance than they would as free workers. The system, then, was uneconomical for the mine owners, whose labor costs were artificially high. Such waste was possible only because mining demanded the collection and supervision of labor in one place. But in the early 1770s, one might well ask whether the labor system of the Scottish mines and American plantations was as anachronistic as Miller suggested. It is an intriguing fact that the decade of 1763 and to 1773, which brought such widespread interest in the economics of slavery, also saw the portentous impact of the spiny jenny and the water frame, and the sudden leap forward in the quantity and quality of yarn production would bring an unprecedented demand for raw cotton and prepare the way for Eli Whitney's simple invention and all its woeful consequences. And there are those who would see certain similarities between the colonial plantation and the textile factories which emerged from Richard Arkwright's Derby workshops, where even by 1773 women and children were producing pure cotton calicos. But it was this very context of stirring economic change that gave force to Miller's central point. He wrote after a decade of unparalleled innovation in British transportation, agriculture, mining, and iron production. He admired and represented the spirit of men like John Roebuck, Richard Arkwright, Matthew Boulton, and Josiah Wedgwood. Human progress, he maintained, meant a widening influence of utility and efficiency. It meant an accelerating growth of new techniques and inventions, an increase in skill and disciplined concentration, and above all, expanding production of cheaper and improved commodities. In the last analysis, therefore, colonial slavery was a crime against humanity because it epitomized those forces of barbarism, ignorance, and wastefulness which blocked the way to a material happiness almost within the reach of man. Okay, I think we've got about 5 pages left. A bit more than that. Okay. The Enlightenment disseminated ideas that could serve the defender of slavery as well as the abolitionist. If the main current of secular thought ran against any institution that arbitrarily deprived men of liberty and happiness, discussion of servitude prior to the 1760s tended to be cautiously abstract and hedged with qualifications. But Arthur O. Lovejoy has observed that a term or set of phrases which gain acceptance because one meaning meets the needs of a particular age may help to alter beliefs as other meanings are gradually seen. There is evidence of this phenomenon in the changing connotations of such words as slavery, bondage, and emancipation. In the 1760s, the physiocrats called for emancipation from the economic slavery of monopoly and special privilege. And despite this their agrarian bias, their rhetoric was congenial to the aspirations of budding industrialists. Radicals like de Holbach repeatedly used the terms of personal slavery to describe any legal or political system which subordinated public welfare to the whims of a favored few. That sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? In 1769, Gentleman's Magazine attacked the policy of sending troops to America, reminding Britons that all continental Europe had been enslaved by taxes and standing armies. In the eyes of French and American Republicans, all Englishmen were slaves. In the eyes of patriotic Englishmen, the French were the slaves of a Bourbon despot. The Bernardin St. Pierre, an engineer who had seen Negro slavery in Ile-de-France, perceived an ominous connection between the various meanings of servitude. He warned the rulers of France that they could not remain free unless their people were free. The intolerant always reap the harvest of their own intolerance. Also sounds familiar. Tyrannical ideas were like a plague. If allowed to spread in the colonies, they would soon infect the entire realm. Also sounds familiar. Already the wealthy colonial slaveholders had allied with the most conservative nobility and had begun to treat the people of France like American Negroes. If colonial slavery was not abolished, the liberties of France could not survive. Few writers made the connection so explicit, but the political and constitutional crisis beginning in the 1760s evoked a contagious fear that traditional authorities could no longer be trusted, that traditional liberties were no longer secure. As Robert R. Palmer has pointed out, the 7 Years' War intensified strains between central governments and various quote-unquote constituted bodies, which ranged from the aristocratic councils to the relatively democratic assemblies of some colonies. Burdened by mountainous debts, central governments inaugurated administrative reforms and searched for more effective means of raising revenue. The constituted bodies interpreted all encroachments on their corporate rights as moves toward slavery. From Geneva to Boston, these bitter conflicts undermined fundamental ideas of sovereignty, and as various elites dug in to defend their traditional prerogatives, they were also challenged by middle-class groups who sought more direct access to sources of power. Partly as a result of rapid economic changes, class divisions seemed to widen and to lose much of their aura of prescriptive or providential sanction. When it became obvious that aristocratic rank was a purchasable commodity, there was a growing suspicion that most authority was without legitimate title, and there was no more perfect symbol of untitled power than the colonial planter. America was the stage on which a Hamlet-like Europe witnessed the play within the play. The New World was where the fears and aspirations of the 1760s were first dramatized, where extra-legal associations of common citizens defied acts of a sovereign power, where abstract ideals of political philosophy were substantiated in the actions of ordinary men. After 1760, Europe absorbed a swelling stream of books and articles that assessed the meaning of this new spirit of freedom, and with few exceptions, the literature focused particular attention on the anomaly of Negro slavery. There were various ways in which Negro slavery became entangled with colonial grievances. When young Arthur Lee was studying in Britain in the 1760s, for example, he was shocked and outraged to discover the following passage in Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Quote, "There is not a Negro from the coast of Africa who does not possess a degree of magnanimity which the soul of his sordid master is too often scarce capable of conceiving. Fortune never exerted more cruelly her empire over mankind than when she subjected those nations of heroes to the refuse of the jails of Europe." End quote. In 1764, the year he received a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh, Lee published an essay which told the renowned Adam Smith that Virginians, at least, were not descended from the scum of Europe, but from some of the finest families in England, and Negroes, far from being a nation of heroes, were, quote, "a race the most detestable and vile that ever the earth produced." End quote. Lee assured his readers that he was a man of the Enlightenment and was sensitive to the liberal spirit of his age. He piously quoted the anti-slavery arguments of Hutcheson and Montesquieu and took their side against Puffendorf and Grotius. The latter's views on killing prisoners of war, Lee said, were more worthy of an African savage than a European philosopher. But writers like Smith failed to appreciate that American slaves lived in palaces compared with the peasants of Scotland, and worst of all, they displayed a total ignorance of the Negro character. Even Aristotle, who had said slaves could have no virtue, quote, "knew not of any who were so utterly devoid of any semblance of virtue as are the Africans." End quote. If men like Smith were sincerely interested in the question, they should do something to end the slave trade, which was a European crime, rather than slander poor Americans who had made the best of a burdensome and unfortunate institution. Lee hinted the calumnies against American slaveholders were part of the growing spirit of contempt for the rights and feelings of colonists. Already British merchants had secured the enactment of arbitrary restrictions and impositions which threatened to enslave all Americans. In 1764, these same measures provoked another and well-known assertion of colonial rights. James Otis also saw certain connections between Negro slavery and the infringement of colonial liberties, but Otis's vantage point was different from that of Lee. Curiously enough, he also attacked Grotius and Puffendorf for accepting ancient abuses as the law of nations. But unlike Arthur Lee, he quoted Rousseau as the modern authority on natural rights and liberties. He argued that Americans, after separating themselves from European society, had actually passed through a state of nature before founding societies of their own. Their knowledge that all men were born free was based on more than theory, and after reaching this conclusion, Otis turned abruptly to Negro slavery, which, quote, "threatens one day to reduce both Europe and America to the ignorance and barbarity of the darkest ages." End quote. Otis did not expand upon the point, except to ridicule those who defended servitude on racial grounds. His purpose was to warn his fellow colonists that slavery would be their own certain fate if they allowed the British government to take their property without consent. There was, however, a more subtle connection between bondage and economic oppression. New Englanders saw the Sugar Act as part of the conspiracy engineered by British West Indian interests. Otis suggested that while the continental colonists had fought bravely in the war against France and were now accused of paying too little for imperial defense, the West Indians, who had done nothing to win the war were using political influence to increase their riches and impoverish their patriotic brethren of the North. How was one to account for such depravity? Dealing in slaves, Otis remarked, quote, has a certain tendency to diminish the idea of the inestimable value of liberty and makes every dealer in it a tyrant. It is a clear truth that those who every day barter away other men's liberty will soon care little for their own. Again, something that sounds familiar. The only idea Creole planters had of government was of an overseer coercing tens of thousands of men. For a little gain, the Creole would betray British ideals of liberty and make slaves of even his own posterity. Less than 2 years after Otis's pamphlet, John Adams heard that the West Indies had not stood with the continental colonies in resisting the Stamp Act, and he recorded these bitter words in his diary. Quote, but can no punishment be devised for Barbados and Port Royal in Jamaica for their base desertion of the cause of liberty, their mean, timid resignation to slavery? They deserve to be made slaves to their own negroes, but they live under the scorching sun which melts them, dissipates their spirits, and relaxes their nerves. Yet their negroes seem to have more of the spirit of liberty than they. I could wish that some of their blacks had been appointed distributors and inspectors, etc., over their masters. This would have but a little aggravated the indignity. End quote. Imperial conflict had suddenly given ideological force to the theories of Montesquieu and to analogies and herbal to analogies and verbal associations which had become commonplace in 18th century literature. And since ideology demands self-discipline and conformity, it is not surprising that in 1766 the citizens of Boston instructed their representatives, including Otis and Samuel Adams, to purify Massachusetts by moving for a prohibition on the importation and purchase of slaves. Because the American and French revolutions had a profound influence on the early history of anti-slavery movements, they fall beyond the scope of this volume. We may note that the obvious fact that political instability is seldom conducive to long-range plans for reform. It's interesting that he mentions that because he wrote a book called The Problem of Slavery in the Time of Revolution, I think. In the Age of Revolution. Assertions of the right to self-government, which were to be heard in Jamaica and St. Domingue, as well as in Massachusetts, blocked the way to abolitionist schemes that depended on centralized power. In time of war, attitudes towards slavery were dominated by questions of security. A serious paper shortage reduced the number of all publications, including anti-slavery tracts. Yet it would be a mistake to think that the eruption of revolutionary forces diverted attention from Negro slavery. The crisis of the 1760s and 1770s left a sense of expectancy of an approaching fulfillment, which would be an essential catalyst in transforming abstract ideals into military anti-slavery protest. This international mood of change, the expectation of an impending age of liberty or bondage, provided a matrix in which religious, philosophical, literary, and economic trends could converge. The developing pattern can perhaps best be seen in the pages of Ephemerides, blah, 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 that magazine. In 1769, DuPont demonstrated his keen interest in the cause of the American colonists by reprinting John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and by making some highly significant remarks on a letter which Benjamin Rush had sent from Philadelphia to Jacques Barbeau de Bourges, a physician, botanist, and friend of Benjamin Franklin. There could be no doubt DuPont said that the British colonies of North America would develop into an empire of greater extent and power than all of Europe, if only their inhabitants could keep from making discriminatory distinctions between Pennsylvanians and Virginians, Europeans and savages, blacks and whites. This was what gave such overwhelming importance to Dr. Rush's report that, quote unquote, our Quakers had held a great meeting in which they had agreed unanimously to set their Negroes free, and that the majority of Pennsylvania Friends had already complied with the decision. While Rush was guilty of considerable exaggeration, he did not fail to draw a timely moral from the story. Quote, "It would be useless for us to denounce the servitude to which the Parliament of Great Britain wishes to reduce us, while we continue to keep our fellow creatures in slavery just because their color is different from ours." End quote. DuPont was certain that the example of the honest Quakers would soon inspire all Pennsylvanians to free their slaves, and that the benefits would then be so apparent that the other colonies would rapidly follow suit. Nor would the consequences stop there. Through much of Europe the people still suffered from the stifling effects of serfdom. Even the proprietors, who were neither very free nor wealthy, were beginning to see the need for reform. While it would hurt Europe's vanity, DuPont concluded she might have much to learn from the New World. 2 years later, DuPont showed that the slavery issue could be used as a means of synthesizing an even wider range of values and of articulating a more unlimited faith in man's spiritual and material progress. The occasion was a review of the third edition of Jean-François de Saint-Lambert's La Saison, a work which copied James Thomson in more than title, and which exploited all the devices of literary sensibility and primitivism. After expressing contempt for frivolous verse which merely amused, and the editor praised Saint Lambert as un poète sublime, which meant not only that he aroused emotions of love, pity, horror, and hatred, but that the emotions were objectively related to the best interest of mankind. DuPont was almost wholly concerned with a tale called Zimio, which the poet had appended to his work. Zimio was a story of the young Apollo from Benin, who tells of the happy innocence of Africa and the grisly horrors of the Middle Passage, who prays to Orisa, god of both blacks and whites, for deliverance, and who leads the armed Marrons in the hills of Jamaica. Quote unquote, George Filmer, that's in quotations. The English narrator, oh, it's the character, okay. The English narrator concludes with an eloquent attack on avarice and the mercantile spirit, the principles of Hobbes and Machiavelli, theories of racial inferiority, and all violators of natural law. But what most excited DuPont was the realization that this moral passion and poetic sublimity could now be confirmed by the rigorously practical science of economics. It could now be proved that injustice earned no profit, that l'homme n'est point, something about men, no something or other. It was Saint Lambert's noble savage, with all his overtones of righteous retribution, who served as a springboard for DuPont's elaboration of Franklin's statistics. For his most detailed calculations on the unprofitability of slave labor, and for his confident prediction that the slave system would be doomed as soon as the First Nations saw the advantage of buying sugar from free laborers on the coast of Africa. Despite their wide differences in every other realm of thought, a growing number of evangelicals and philosophes, of Quakers and revolutionaries, were coming to sense that American slavery might symbolize all the forces that threatened the true destiny of man. Even though that one was only like 25 pages, that felt like a long one. And the next one is extremely long. So I am definitely going to have to stop in the middle of it somewhere. I'll try to find a good stopping point, roughly halfway or a little bit past halfway through, because then that will be for the Thursday reading, and then that way Sunday we'll finish up the rest of that chapter and the epilogue. So between now and Thursday, I'll figure out where my ending point is, because the next chapter is very nearly 40 pages, and then another 10 of epilogue, and there's no way I'll make it through that. So that'll be that for this session. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I'm still really enjoying this book, but you can tell the longer I read, the more I start stumbling. So I don't want to make them too long. Anyway, that'll be it for this session. I will end this, take a bit of a break, and then decide whether or not I'm going to play some Mass Effect 3. I'm not sure. I may. If I do, that'll be what I play. So either I'll see you in a little bit, or I'll see you tomorrow night. Oh, and check out the ending music. I changed all 3 musics.
My heart's beats, I know, it's broken, and one is because I have seen the bar. I have no supply to play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take you, leave it behind. Someone will break. I left you my home. What did you do? You used to abuse. You left me soft. Was my love? Was it dark? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? It's broken, and one is because I have seen the bar. I have no supply to play. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't overtake. If you leave it behind, someone will break. I left you my home. What did you do? You used to abuse. You left me soft. Was my love true? Was it dark? You have no answer.